That is the case.
No, that's not the case at all. Calling in Lees-Galloway.
Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to speak this evening on the Land Transport and Road User Charges Legislation Amendment Bill. Here we are at the first reading. It's just to make sure all members are clear about comes before the Select Committee phase. And as a member of the Transport and Industrial Relations Select Committee, I'm looking forward to getting the opportunity to consider this legislation. It's, well... Oh, I am looking forward to this, Darian Fenton, because I'm sick and tired of the employment legislation that we're considering at the moment. I'm enjoying the submissions that we are getting from various submitters telling us what an appalling piece of legislation that is, and how it's going to depress wages and how it is going to make workers more vulnerable. But I have to say it's a pretty depressing situation all around, and that's why you're quite right, Mr. Speaker. That's why I want to come back to this bill, and that's why I am looking forward to the opportunity to consider this piece of legislation, which is somewhat more innocuous than that awful piece of employment legislation. It's appropriate, sir, that Simon Bridges read the first reading of the speech. We're not entirely sure whether it means it is now in Simon Bridges' name. If it was now in Simon Bridges' name, that would be even more appropriate. The reason for that is because this is essentially a piece of legislation to tidy up mistakes made in the last road user charges legislation that this government passed. And of course the reason why it's appropriate that Simon Bridges is in charge of this legislation is because when he passed the Crown Minerals Amendment Bill just 6 weeks later, we were back in the House considering a raft of amendments because that minister couldn't pass the legislation without stuffing it up and getting it all wrong. So again, here we are, tidying up legislation that the government got wrong the first time around. It is a waste of time. I think the public would be far more appreciative if the government could just do its homework and get its legislation right the first time around. The other thing, of course, that we're tidying up here is not one but 2 inquiries or 2 reports that the Regulations Review Committee had to carry out into the regulations that were made by the Governor-General as a result of that initial piece of legislation. And, of course, some of those regulations ended up being disallowed. And then some of them were reinstated again by the Minister, and the Regulations Review Committee carried out another inquiry and produced another report, and finally the government has got round to doing what the Regulations Review Committee suggested, which is to put these changes into legislation. My colleague, the Honourable Marion Street, who is the chair of the Regulations Review Committee, will go into that in more detail later on this evening. What does the bill do? Well, it does essentially 4 things. It provides for a new regulation-making power to exempt vehicles from road user charges that are not required to be registered. It allows for a new annual charge in place of road user charges for some vehicles exempt from road user charges. It creates a new offence provisions in relation to exemptions granted under Section 40 of the RUC Act, and it contains 7, quote, minor technical amendments. So what do each of those things do? Well, it's interesting actually, because what they do is they allow for some vehicles that are used for the most part by farmers to be exempt from road user charges. And the reason is, there's a fair reason that for the most part these vehicles are used off-road, they're used on-farm, and sometimes they need to go on the road, up the road to the next lot of paddocks and back onto the farm again, and the amount of time that they actually spend on the road is really quite insignificant, and there's very little need to be collecting ruck. But because the law wasn't drafted properly in the first place, in many instances those vehicles are actually in breach of the current law. It seems unusual for the National Party to put their supporting farmers at risk, but it's true that that's what they did. That's what they did. And now they've had to come back and tidy this up. So in general, unregistered vehicles are not allowed to be used on the road. but this of course does not apply to vehicles that are exempt from registration or are not required to be registered under the Land Transport Motor Vehicle Registration and Licensing Regulations 2011 tau henare, or to unregistered vehicles operated under trade plates. Under the RUC Act, unregistered RUC vehicles are subject to RUC unless they belong to a class of vehicle that is defined as being exempt under the RUC Act. It is not possible to issue RUC distance licences for unregistered RUC vehicles because distance licences are issued against a vehicle's registration number. Operators of unregistered RUC vehicles cannot be compliant tau henare, with the RUC Act when travelling on roads. So they've basically made criminals out of every farmer in the country, and now they've had to come back and tidy it up. There is a new annual charge involved here, so that for those vehicles that do spend a bit more time on the road, this is a very sensible provision to allow for an annual fee that they can pay in lieu of the RUC that they would ordinarily pay. It seems interesting to me, Mr. Speaker, that this legislation is being passed to ensure that a small group of people don't have to pay their road user charges. They don't have to pay into the National Land Transport Fund, when the last piece of legislation that the government passed that related to the National Land Transport Fund actually put road user charges through fuel excise tax up for every single New Zealander. So this is a government that says it wants to cut taxes, and sure, it cuts taxes for a few. It cuts income tax for the top 10%, and it's cutting RUC for a handful of farmers, but it puts taxes up for everybody else. Everybody else who drives their car, driving their kids to school, driving to work, all those people have to pay more under this government, when the farmers get to pay less. That is what this government means when it says it's cutting taxes. It's cutting taxes for its mates, and it's putting taxes up for everybody else. That's what the National Party means when it says it's going to cut taxes, sir. So, Mr. Speaker, this is a fairly technical amendment. It is designed to do one thing really, and one thing only: tidy up the mistakes that the National Party made the first time round. So we on the Labor side, we're quite happy to help the government tidy up its mistakes. We're quite happy to help the government tidy up its mistakes. We will see this bill go to Select Committee. I look forward to the raft of submissions that will come in on this bill. Probably slightly fewer than we've had on the Employment Relations Act amendments that we're considering right now. But, sir, in the interest of helping this government tidy up its mistakes, Labor will support this bill to Select Committee.
I call David Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It gives me great pleasure to speak on the Land Transport and Road User Charges Amendment Bill, first reading. And isn't it a pleasure to see a new member like Ian Lees-Galloway try and do a 10-minute speech? Try and do 10 minutes, couldn't stick to the bill, had to go on about other things, wouldn't stick to the bill. But he's the silent partner of the Transport and Industrial Relations Committee, sits there meekly day after day, followed by unionists either side of him, not allowed to say a word, and he sits on that committee, doesn't say a word. No, exactly, silver spoon, but he's going in. He's best mates with another silver spoon, Mr. Herne Bay, 1994. Those two together are going to be the new team for the Labor Party, Herne Bay and Palmerston North. Oh, we're looking forward to seeing that happening.
Point of order.
Oh, got to stop it, don't you, Trev?
Point of order. Look, a point of order is heard in silence. The Honourable Trevor Mallow.
Mr. Speaker, members are to be referred to by their names or by their electorates, and this member knows that he is breaching that.
Yes, I've had to rule on this earlier today. There is a Speaker's ruling, 28.1. Members will refer to members by their names. David Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Ian Lees